Chapter 1. The Night It Rained in Denver. At 51, I was delivering pizza through a storm that felt heavier than the rain itself. My life had shrunk to one delivery at a time, one streetlight at a time, and one more night trying to forget the man I used to be. When the mansion door opened, I expected another tired customer, not an old man falling to his knees in front of me. His eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. He whispered my father's name like it was a secret kept alive too long, then told me the truth that froze the air between us. The company that ruined me, the one that took everything I had, was built on my father's land. Rain had been falling for hours, a steady drumming against the windshield, as I wound my way through the narrow roads of northwest Denver. The wipers fought to keep up, and the headlights barely pierced the curtain of water. I had 3 more deliveries before the end of my shift, but the address glowing on my phone felt wrong for pizza. The pin dropped on a quiet hill, lined with tall oaks and driveways, too long for working people. I killed the engine and listened to the ticking of the cooling hood, to the storm and to my own breathing. I grabbed the box, tucked it under my jacket, and jogged toward the door. By the time I reached the porch, the rain had soaked through everything. I rang the bell once. The chime echoed faintly inside, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. An old man stood there, thin and silver-haired, his shoulders wrapped in a wool cardigan that looked older than me. His eyes, gray and sharp, scanned my face as if he were searching for a name he had lost decades ago. I started to speak, but his lips trembled. His hand rose halfway to his mouth. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You are Thomas Cole's boy, aren't you?" I froze. The pizza box slipped slightly in my hand. No one had said my father's name to me in years. "Who are you?" I asked. The old man blinked, the words catching in his throat. "My God, it's you!" He stepped closer, his voice shaking. "I have been waiting for you for more than 30 years. Rain blew in through the open doorway, cold against my back. I hesitated, but something in his expression stopped me from leaving. He wasn't crazy. He looked more like a man who had just seen a ghost. He stepped aside and motioned me in. "Please, come inside, son. You shouldn't be out in this weather." The warmth hit me like a wave. The house smelled of cedar and old books. Lamps cast a soft amber glow over a living room filled with framed photographs, maps, and stacks of folders. I placed the box on a small table by the entryway, unsure what else to do. He shut the door and turned to face me. "My name is Arthur Jennings." He paused as if testing whether I recognized it. I didn't. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Your father and I built something together once. A dream." I must have looked confused, because he gestured for me to follow. He led me down a hallway lined with black and white photos. At the end was one that stopped me cold. 2 men, young and sunburned, signing papers at a construction site. My father was there, smiling in that confident way he had when he believed nothing could go wrong. Next to him stood a younger version of the man before me. "That was the day we founded Jennings Cole Development Trust," Arthur said quietly. 1991. I stared at the photo, the corners of my throat tightening. I hadn't seen my father's face like that in decades. I remembered being a boy sitting in the passenger seat of his truck, watching him draw building plans on napkins. He died when I was 12, heart attack behind the wheel. After that, everything my mother owned was sold off, and I never really asked questions. Arthur pulled a faded folder from a drawer and placed it on a small desk. Inside were contracts, maps, and a deed stamped with my father's name. He looked up at me. "After he passed, I tried to find your mother, but she had moved. The project stalled. For years I thought it was over. Then in 1994, the city finally approved our plans." He pointed to a map of Colorado spread across the desk. "The area we bought," he said, "is right here, Summit Ridge. You wouldn't recognize it now." It's become one of the biggest technology hubs in the state. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to process it. My father had owned land? Valuable land? Arthur gave a small smile. He left half of the company to his heirs. I kept it safe. Your share still belongs to you, Ethan. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. He walked to the window and gestured for me to join him. Outside, beyond the trees, the faint glow of city lights flickered through the rain. His voice dropped lower. The company that built its headquarters there is Hendrix Industries. The name hit like a hammer. I turned toward him. You mean? Yes, the same Hendrix Industries that destroyed you? They built their empire on your father's land. For a moment, everything in me went still. I could hear the rain hammering against the glass, the ticking of an old clock in the hallway, and somewhere deep in my chest, the faint echo of a heartbeat I hadn't felt in years. Arthur looked at me with something between sorrow and relief. He said softly, "Justice takes time, son. Sometimes a lifetime." I stared out the window at the sheets of rain, sliding down the glass. My reflection looked older, harder, like a man I barely recognized. That night I realized something. Justice never dies. It just waits, and maybe, after all this time, it had been waiting for me. The storm kept raging outside, but inside the house it was quiet, except for the sound of water dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floor. Arthur turned away from the window and began to gather more files from his desk. He said we had a lot to talk about. I nodded, still staring into the darkness beyond the glass, knowing deep down that whatever conversation came next would change everything. The wind rattled the windows again, a final clap of thunder rolling over the hill, and the lights flickered once before settling. Arthur motioned toward the living room. "Sit down, Ethan. We have a great deal to discuss." I looked at him, at the worn lines on his face, and for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion. Not hope exactly, but the faint shape of it, buried under the rain. I hung my wet jacket on the chair and followed him deeper into the house, not knowing that the past I had buried was already rising to meet me. Chapter 2. The years buried under dust. I used to think life could only break once. That after the first betrayal, after the first fall, everything that came next would just be noise. But I was wrong. It happened in small ways, long before the storm that ended it all. 10 years earlier, I was still a man people trusted. I worked at Hendrix Industries in downtown Chicago, managing logistics for a company that shipped half the Midwest's tech equipment. I was good at it, organized, calm under pressure, the kind of man who fixed problems quietly before anyone above noticed. People liked me. They used to anyway. My divorce from Melissa had been civil, or at least I thought it was. We shared 2 kids, Caleb and Rachel, and kept things polite for their sake. She was ambitious, sharper than me when it came to navigating social circles. We met in college, married too young, and by 40 we had grown into strangers sharing a mortgage. When she left, I let her go. I thought peace was better than pride. In 2020, I was 41. That winter, the company threw its annual holiday gala at a hotel off Michigan Avenue. I went because attendance was expected. The ballroom shimmered with glass chandeliers and expensive laughter. I remember standing near the back, nursing a drink, when a voice cut through the crowd. Richard Hendrix, our CEO, had arrived, tall, tanned, and practiced in the art of being admired. Cameras followed him naturally, as if the world tilted toward his smile. He tapped his glass for attention and announced that he wanted to introduce someone special, his fiancée. When she stepped out beside him, I felt the air leave my chest. Melissa. Her hair was swept back, her dress a shade of silver that caught the light like ice. She didn't flinch when she saw me. Instead, she smiled, a careful, polished smile that said she had rehearsed this moment. Richard brought her over, shaking hands with the board members. When we came face to face, he said lightly, "Ethan, you two already know each other, don't you?" I nodded once. Her hand touched mine, cool and precise. For a heartbeat our eyes met. There was nothing left of the woman I had once loved. The night blurred after that. People congratulated them. Glasses clinked, and I drifted through the noise like a ghost. I left early, walking through the freezing streets of Chicago, feeling the snow sting my face. 6 months later, everything collapsed. It started with an email from compliance asking me to come in for a routine audit. When I arrived, 2 security officers were waiting. They escorted me to a conference room where Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression carved in stone. A young woman from accounting slid a folder toward me. Inside were transaction records showing a pattern of missing shipments over 3 months, each one traced back to my authorization code. I told them there had to be a mistake. I asked for time to review the data. Richard didn't answer. He just looked at me like I had disappointed him personally. Melissa was there too, sitting at the far end of the table, silent. When I met her eyes, she looked away. The next day, my access badge stopped working. I found out through an internal memo that I had been placed on leave pending investigation. My colleagues avoided me in the hallways. A week later, corporate security searched my apartment. Caleb was the one who came to help. He had just passed the bar exam and was full of the kind of belief only new lawyers have. He said, "Dad, they need evidence. They can't just do this." But they could. And they did. At the hearing, the company lawyers presented digital proof that the missing inventory had been rerouted to an address in Indiana. The shipping orders had my signature. The bank account tied to the transaction had my name. Melissa gave a short statement, verifying that I had full access to those accounts. She never looked at me once while she spoke. I didn't defend myself. Somewhere deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Richard had already made up his mind. When the session ended, he said in front of everyone, "We expected better from you, Ethan." The words cut deeper than I expected. Rachel came by that night, angry and confused. She asked if it was true. I told her it wasn't, but I could see doubt flicker in her eyes. She was only 14, caught between love and what adults told her was truth. She cried until she fell asleep on the couch. A week later, the company announced my termination for breach of trust. Within days, every recruiter in my network stopped replying. The logistics world is small. Word travels faster than truth. I sold my car, my house, everything I couldn't carry. By the end of the year, I was living in a small apartment outside Denver, taking whatever work I could find. Warehouse shifts, night security, janitorial gigs. It's amazing how quickly people learn not to ask questions when they sense shame. By 2022, I was driving for a local pizza place. It paid enough to keep the lights on and my phone running. Most nights I delivered to students or tired families, faces I'd never see again. The job was simple, quiet, anonymous. Sometimes that was a mercy. But loneliness has a way of sharpening memory. There were nights I'd sit in my car after a shift, staring at my hands, wondering how the same hands that once signed multi-million-dollar contracts were now covered in grease and cardboard dust. Caleb still called from time to time. He had found work with a small law firm in St. Louis. He kept saying he would clear my name someday, but I told him to forget it. Rachel stopped calling altogether. She was in college, busy living a life that didn't need me. The nights stretched long, filled with the hum of the city and the smell of rain on asphalt. I told myself it was enough. Survival, routine, quiet, but some wounds don't close. They just wait. It was late one Friday when the text came. I had just parked behind the shop, exhausted, ready to clock out. The message glowed on my cracked phone screen, a number I didn't recognize. Justice isn't dead, it's waiting for the right person to find it. No name, no signature, just those words. I stared at them for a long time, trying to decide if it was a joke or a threat. Then I realized I didn't care which. For the first time in years, something stirred that wasn't bitterness. I sat there with the engine off, the sound of rain beginning to fall again. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement like scattered memories. I didn't know it yet, but that message was the first crack in the wall I had built around myself. The phone buzzed once more. The same number. Just coordinates. A location near the outskirts of the city. I hesitated, then deleted the text, but the words stayed, carved somewhere behind my ribs, whispering through the quiet. Justice isn't dead. It's waiting. I didn't answer that night. I went home, locked the door, and tried to sleep. But even as I closed my eyes, the rain kept falling, steady and patient, like it had nowhere else to go. Chapter 3. The contracts that time forgot morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that feels like it's been filtered through smoke. I hadn't slept much. The words from that night kept circling in my head, echoing beneath the rhythm of the rain. Justice isn't dead. It's waiting. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that house, but before noon, I was standing again in front of Arthur Jennings's door. He opened it before I could knock, as if he had been waiting. His cardigan hung loose, the same one he'd worn the night before. Without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The warmth hit me again, mixed with the faint scent of coffee and old wood polish. "You came," he said, his voice softer now. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. I just nodded. Arthur led me past the living room to a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed before. At the end stood a thick metal door, the kind that looked like it belonged in a bank, not a house. He pulled a small set of keys from his pocket, hesitated for a moment, then turned the lock. The hinges groaned as the vault opened. Inside, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Folders, rolled blueprints, ledgers thick with dust. He flicked on a single bulb overhead, casting a yellow light across decades of paper. "Your father helped me build this trust," he said. "Jennings Coal Development Trust. We bought 60 acres of undeveloped land at Summit Ridge back in 1991. He walked slowly toward a map pinned to the wall, his fingers tracing the boundaries. It was nothing back then, just open space and scrub. He wanted to build something honest, something lasting. I stepped closer. The handwriting on the survey marks was familiar. My father's neat, careful script. Arthur sighed. When Thomas died, everything stalled. The city shelved our application, and I was told to move on. But I didn't. In 1994, when the technology boom hit Colorado, the city reopened bids for development. I used the trust's funds to carry on the project, but I never touched his share. It stayed under his name. "Under yours." He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a thick folder, edges yellowed. Inside were copies of deeds, contracts, and tax statements. He laid them out carefully across the desk. "I spent years reinvesting the profits," he said. "It grew beyond anything we imagined. Today, your father's half of the trust is worth $612 million. The number felt unreal, like a punch thrown underwater. I looked at him, half expecting a smirk, some sign this was a cruel joke, but Arthur's eyes were steady, clear. He smiled faintly. "I didn't call you here for money, Ethan. I called you for truth." I swallowed, feeling the room tilt. Truth had cost me everything once. I wasn't sure I could afford it again. Arthur poured 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. He sat, his hands trembling slightly as he turned another page in the ledger. "Here," he said, tapping a section of text. "This clause was your father's idea. We called it the corporate ethics provision." He slid the paper toward me. The words were typed on a faded page, marked with my father's initials. The clause stated that any company leasing land from the trust and found guilty of 3 ethical or legal violations within 10 years would forfeit its lease rights permanently. It was simple, direct, and brutal. I could almost hear my father's voice saying it. Arthur looked up. That clause has only been invoked once. The companies that came through here were careful. Until recently. He turned a few more pages, revealing a column of tenant names, each with numbered plots. I scanned the list, the letters blurring until one line snapped into focus. Lot 14. Hendrix Industries. The air felt heavier suddenly. I read it again, tracing my finger over the name. Arthur noticed. They've been leasing from us since 2001. I had no idea until last month that it was the same Hendrix you once worked for. They built their headquarters on what used to be your father's main property. I sat back, the coffee cooling in my hands. It made sense now. The arrogance of Richard Hendrix, the company's expansion into Colorado, the polished PR about sustainability and innovation. It was all sitting on land that should have carried my father's name. Arthur watched me quietly. His voice dropped lower. You see the symmetry in it, don't you? The men who buried you professionally built their empire on your family's ground. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My chest felt tight, full of something between rage and disbelief. For years I'd been trying to move on, telling myself what happened in Chicago was just bad luck, corporate politics. But this wasn't random. This was a circle closing. Arthur reached for a smaller folder labeled Compliance Reports. He said, 3 ethical violations, Ethan. That's all it takes. I've been keeping records. They're close. He spread out the documents, one after another. Environmental fines, employee discrimination suits, a pending investigation into data manipulation, each one stamped with the same company logo I once wore on my chest. I stared at the papers, the logos, the signatures, until they blurred together. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the light overhead. Finally, Arthur said, I kept this secret because I needed the right person to handle it. Someone with reason, someone with history. I let out a hollow laugh. History, I said. That's one word for it. He leaned forward, his eyes steady. I'm not asking you to destroy them, Ethan. I'm asking you to reclaim what's already yours. The clock on the wall ticked once, loud in the silence. I looked at my father's signature again, faded but legible, and felt something shift inside me. A memory of his voice came back, telling me to always finish what I start. I whispered, they built their empire on the same ground where they buried me. Arthur nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting to hear those words. Then he said, maybe it's time to dig it back up. I stood there a long while, surrounded by papers that had outlived the men who signed them, feeling the weight of 30 years press down and then slowly lift. The rain had stopped outside, leaving only the sound of dripping eaves and the low creak of the house settling. Arthur closed the folder and placed a hand on it. Tomorrow, we begin. I didn't ask what he meant. Some part of me already knew. The past was awake now, and there was no putting it back to sleep. Chapter 4. Shadows in the System. The next few days moved like a current pulling me somewhere. I wasn't ready to go. Arthur called a meeting with a woman named Patricia Norwell, an attorney who handled corporate ethics and property law. She arrived at the house one cold afternoon, her briefcase stacked with files, and her confidence filling the room before she even sat down. She looked around the study, nodded at the shelves, then turned her attention to me. Arthur tells me you're the rightful heir to the coal share of the trust, she said, sliding her glasses into place. I nodded. Good, she went on. That makes this next part much easier and much more dangerous. She spread out documents on the table, neatly organized by colored tabs. Hendrix Industries currently has 3 pending ethics lawsuits in Colorado State Court, she said, tapping each one with a pen. workplace discrimination, environmental misreporting, and one whistleblower claim involving data manipulation. Each of these counts under the corporate ethics provision. If they lose even one more case, we can legally revoke their lease. Arthur leaned back, rubbing his temples. That would set off a chain reaction, he muttered. Their headquarters is sitting on 40% of the ridge. Patricia didn't flinch. It would, but the law is the law. She turned to me. The question is, do you want to pursue it? I stared at the papers, the company name bold at the top of every page. Hendrix Industries, the same name that had followed me like a shadow for years. I said quietly, I want what belongs to my father. She nodded once, satisfied. Then we begin with silence. You say nothing. You move quietly. You collect evidence before anyone knows why. Arthur frowned. I'm not sure that's wise, Patricia. My son, Evan, handles day-to-day oversight for the trust. If he gets wind of this, he'll assume we're transferring control. Then maybe he shouldn't get wind of it, she said sharply. Arthur's expression tightened. He didn't answer. Over the next week, Patricia and I met almost daily. She was relentless, methodical, the kind of person who could turn a tangle of laws into a blade. She dug through compliance records, subpoena histories, and internal memos. Each time we found another infraction, she would smile faintly and mark a small red circle in her notebook. By the fourth day, I asked her how she knew so much about Hendrix. She looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup and said, I used to represent them. Before they decided ethics were optional. Arthur grew quieter as the days passed. I could sense the weight of what we were doing pressing on him. One night, after Patricia left, he sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey. Evan's going to find out, he said finally. He always does. Then tell him the truth, I said. Arthur shook his head. No. Evan's loyal to the trust, not to me. He thinks like a businessman, not a builder. If he learns I plan to transfer ownership to you, he'll fight it. He was right. It happened sooner than anyone expected. I was at the house the next afternoon when I heard shouting from the study. Arthur's voice, strained but firm, and another voice I didn't recognize at first. When I stepped inside, Evan Jennings stood there, tall, well-dressed, mid-40s, with his father's sharp features but none of his warmth. You're giving control to him, he said, his hand slicing through the air, to a man who hasn't been here in 30 years. Arthur's face was pale. It's not about control. It's about correction. Evan's eyes flicked toward me, cold and measuring. Do you know what you're doing, Cole? You're digging into something that built this entire region. If you push this, you'll bring it down on yourself. I said nothing. Arthur tried to speak, but Evan was already storming out. He slammed the door hard enough to shake the glass. Arthur sat heavily in his chair, his hand trembling against the armrest. He'll go to Richard, he said. I could hear the regret in his voice. He did. Later that night, in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown Chicago, Richard Hendrix leaned back in his chair while Evan paced in front of him. The city lights glittered behind them. I wasn't there, but Patricia would later show me the security footage leaked anonymously. Evan's voice was low but sharp. My father's preparing to hand the Cole estate to Ethan. If that happens, you lose the land. Richard smiled. That same smile I remembered from years ago, polished and poisonous. If we control the trust, he said, Cole's revenge dies on arrival. They shook hands. Two men sealing a deal in shadows, both believing they could outsmart the other. Meanwhile, Patricia kept digging. One evening she called me, her voice urgent. I just got something, she said, an email from a source inside Hendrix. You need to see this. I met her at her office the next morning. She closed the blinds before speaking, her face pale. The sender's name was Lydia Harper, a junior PR assistant at the company. The message was short, attached with one file. Patricia opened it. The subject line read, Case 2020, Evidence XLSX, uploaded by M. Carter. For a moment I didn't breathe. The initials burned on the screen. Patricia looked at me carefully. Ethan, she said, I think this proves they framed you. Your ex-wife was part of it. I took the laptop from her, my hands cold. I clicked the attachment. Inside were transaction logs, metadata timestamps, and access histories, each entry lined up with the same shipments that had been used against me. But the upload trail didn't end with my account. It ended with hers. For years I had imagined a dozen explanations for what happened. A mistake, a setup, bad luck, but not this, not her. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Patricia didn't say anything. She didn't have to. It wasn't the money that broke me then, or the years lost, or the reputation ruined. It was the realization that Melissa, the woman who once promised she'd stand by me, had helped destroy me for a man who now sat atop everything that was mine. I closed the laptop slowly. The screen went black, leaving only my reflection in the glass. Losing everything hadn't hurt as much as this moment. Because now I knew who had held the knife. Outside, the sun was setting behind the city skyline, staining the clouds red and gold. Patricia said something about next steps, but her voice felt far away. I stood, buttoned my coat, and walked toward the window. The streets below looked small, full of people hurrying somewhere, unaware that entire empires could rest on a single lie. I said quietly, Justice isn't waiting anymore. It's already moving. Patricia looked at me but didn't speak. She just nodded once. When I left her office that night, the cold air hit hard, sharp enough to wake something in me that had been buried under dust for far too long. I pulled the collar of my jacket higher and walked into the wind, knowing the next move wouldn't be made in secret anymore. Chapter 5, Hospitals and Legacies. Arthur turned his head slightly, his voice raspy but still steady. Evan, stop. This isn't about money or legacy. It's about making things right before there's no time left. Evan's jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists, but he said nothing. After a moment, he left the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a dull thud. Arthur's breathing steadied. He motioned for me to sit closer. I did. His hand, frail and trembling, reached out and closed over mine. Don't let vengeance rot you like it did our industry, he said. I made that mistake once. It eats you slow, until you forget what justice was supposed to feel like. I nodded, but the words hit deep. He looked smaller now, the man who had carried a vision across 3 decades reduced to a whisper in a sterile room. He drew a shaky breath. Promise me, Ethan. Promise you'll finish what your father and I started. Build something honest again. I will, I said quietly. I swear it. He smiled faintly. That's all I needed to hear. Then he reached into the drawer beside his bed. From inside he took a small leather case and pressed it into my palm. Inside was the old trust seal and a folded document bearing his signature. You'll need these, he said. The seal represents authority over your father's half. The document gives you power of attorney. I wanted to argue, to tell him he could still fight, but he was already closing his eyes. His grip loosened, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked at peace. The machines beeped softly. I sat there, holding his hand, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, knowing what was coming. Outside the room, I could hear the sound of rain again. It felt like the same storm had followed me for years, waiting to fall in every place I stood. Later that night, when the nurse covered him with a blanket and dimmed the lights, I stayed until they told me visiting hours were over. In the hallway, Evan was waiting. His eyes were red, though I couldn't tell if it was from grief or anger. He didn't speak when I passed, just stared, his jaw locked, his father's silhouette reflected in the glass behind me. I drove home in silence, the city lights sliding across the windshield. Arthur's words replayed in my mind. Don't let vengeance rot you. But the truth was, it already had. Across town, in another hospital wing, my daughter Rachel was working her shift as a medical intern. She had aged into a version of her mother I barely recognized, more focused, quieter, with eyes that carried questions she never asked. That night she got a call from an emergency room nurse about a new patient brought in from a downtown apartment. When she walked into the room, she froze. It was Melissa. The diagnosis was a mild stroke, temporary paralysis on one side. Melissa looked smaller, older, her hair pulled back in a rough bun. Rachel stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping closer. Melissa smiled weakly. I didn't think you'd come. Rachel kept her tone even. You're my mother. I don't have a choice. The air between them was heavy. Years of silence hung in the space. Melissa's voice cracked when she spoke again. Do you hate me that much? Rachel hesitated. No. I just refuse to become you. Melissa turned away, her eyes glistening. Rachel stood there, her hands at her sides, unsure if she wanted to leave or stay. Then she reached forward and adjusted the blanket at her mother's shoulder, small, deliberate, the way doctors do when they don't know how to comfort a person they still love. Later, sitting in the hospital cafeteria, Rachel called me. Her voice was quiet. Mom's here, she said. Stroke. She's stable. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to rush over. Another part of me couldn't face her. Tell her I'm glad she's alive, I managed. Rachel didn't answer. Then she whispered, You still love her, don't you? I sighed. Love's not the word anymore. It's just what's left when anger finally burns itself out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my apartment, the old floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I thought about my father, Arthur, Melissa, the choices that had woven all our lives together. Forgiveness isn't surrender, it's reclaiming control from the past. I said it out loud, testing the weight of it. The words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like truth. 2 days later, Arthur Jennings passed away in his sleep. Patricia called me early that morning, her voice flat, professional. The way lawyers speak when they're trying not to sound human. I sat for a long time after the call, staring at the folder he had given me, the seal lying next to it. The funeral was held at a small chapel near Summit Ridge. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air cool and clear. People from the trust came, old partners, a few city officials, and Evan. He stood by the front, jaw set, eyes hollow. After the service, as the crowd thinned, he approached me. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie dark as his expression. I waited, knowing what was coming. He stopped a few feet away, his voice low but sharp. I won't let you turn my family's legacy into your revenge. I met his stare. This was never about revenge, I said. It's about truth. Evan's lips curved into something between a smile and a threat. Truth has a cost. Remember that. He turned and walked away, his black shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. I watched him until he disappeared behind the line of cars, the wind tugging at the edge of his coat. The sky was pale, the kind of gray that hides the sun but not the cold. I stood beside Arthur's grave long after everyone else had gone, the trust seal still in my pocket, the weight of it pressing against my palm. I whispered to the ground beneath my feet, I'll finish it, I'll make it right. The wind moved through the trees, gentle but unrelenting, and for the first time in years, I felt both burden and purpose in the same breath. The world had already decided the war was coming. All that remained was to decide what kind of man I'd be when it started. Chapter 6. The Showdown in Chicago. The flight to Chicago was quiet. Patricia sat beside me reviewing documents, her pen tapping against the folder in rhythm with the hum of the engine. I watched the clouds roll beneath us, white and endless, and wondered how many years had passed since I last looked down on this city from above. Too many. The skyline still felt like a scar. When we landed, the air was colder than Denver, sharper, like it remembered me too. We drove straight to the Hendricks Tower, 50 stories of steel and glass that used to make me proud every time I saw it. Now it looked like a monument to something rotten beneath the surface. Patricia didn't speak as we rode the elevator up. She only handed me a copy of Arthur's authorization and said quietly, "When they try to talk over you, let them. Silence unnerves men who think they own the room." The doors opened to a long corridor lined with frosted glass. At the end was the conference room. Inside, Richard Hendricks sat at the head of the table, perfectly groomed, his watch glinting under the light. Melissa was beside him, pale and tense. Across the table were 5 lawyers, all polished, all waiting. Richard stood as we entered, his smile wide but hollow. "Ethan, Patricia. What a surprise! To what do we owe the pleasure?" Patricia set her briefcase on the table. "Emergency board review. You've received the notice." He feigned confusion. "I receive many notices. Perhaps you can remind me." She ignored him, opening her folder. Hendricks Industries currently stands accused of 3 separate ethics violations within the last 5 years. Each case has passed preliminary review, meaning each counts toward the corporate ethics provision in your Summit Ridge lease. Richard's smile thinned. "And what does that mean for us?" "It means," Patricia said, "that per the original Jennings Coal contract, your company's right to occupy Summit Ridge can be revoked, effective immediately." For a long moment, no one spoke. The city stretched out behind Richard through the glass wall, the streets far below glinting with traffic. He leaned back in his chair, his expression cool. "You think you can waltz in here with an old man's paperwork and take $1 billion headquarters out from under me? Ethan, you of all people should know how this company works. You can't just erase 20 years of progress because of a clause in a forgotten contract." I met his eyes. "You erased more than that when you framed me." Melissa flinched slightly, her eyes darting toward the table. Richard caught it, his jaw tightening. Patricia remained steady, pulling out another folder. "This isn't about emotion, Mr. Hendricks. This is law," he snapped, slamming his hand against the table. "Then let's talk law. Because from where I stand, it looks like Mr. Cole is trying to steal what doesn't belong to him." He nodded to one of his lawyers, who slid a document forward. A motion to countersue, claiming fraudulent inheritance. He looked smug again, like the man who had always found a way to win. Patricia didn't blink. She opened another file and slid it across the table. "These are notarized originals, signed by Arthur Jennings. Before his death, they confirm Mr. Cole's authority as successor to Thomas Cole's half of the trust. You'll find the city registry has already validated the transfer." Richard's smirk faded. He flipped through the pages, his jaw working as he read the seals, the dates, the signatures. He leaned back, chuckling low. "So this is your revenge. Drag my company into the mud." "No," I said. "My revenge ended when you built your empire on my father's land. What happens now is balance." Melissa's voice broke the tension. "Richard, maybe we should just listen." He turned on her instantly. "Don't. Not now." But she looked shaken, her hand trembling as she reached for the water glass. I could see it in her eyes, something cracking open. The door at the far end of the room opened suddenly. A young woman stepped in, nervous but determined. Lydia Harper. I recognized the name from Patricia's emails. She clutched a folder against her chest. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but this can't wait." Richard's face drained of color. "What is this?" Lydia glanced at Patricia, then at me. "I have the original 2020 email records from our archive server, the ones your IT team deleted." Patricia gestured for her to hand them over. Lydia opened the folder and slid the printed emails across the table. The subject line at the top was clear. Case, 2020. Evidence, XLS, X, uploaded by M. Carter. Melissa gasped softly. Patricia turned the pages slowly, letting the silence fill the room. Every timestamp, every metadata tag, every forwarding trail pointed back to one terminal. Melissa's, Richard's hand slammed down on the table. That's enough, but it wasn't. Melissa's voice trembled. He made me do it, she said. He said if I didn't, he'd destroy Ethan and take the kids from me. I didn't know he'd actually go through with it. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the lawyers froze. I stared at her, the air thick in my lungs. After all these years, the truth was out, ugly and raw. Patricia spoke calmly. That confession will hold up in court. Combined with the ethical violations, this is enough to nullify your lease. Richard stood, his composure finally slipping. You think you've won. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The door burst open again. Evan Jennings stormed in, face flushed, eyes wild. Where are the documents? He moved toward Patricia, reaching for her folder. Security from the hallway rushed in, grabbing his arm. Let me go, he shouted. You don't know what this means. If Cole takes control, the trust will fall apart. Everything my father built will vanish. Patricia's voice cut through the chaos. Your father built this trust on integrity? You and Richard turned it into corruption. Evan froze, chest heaving. His eyes darted toward Richard, who avoided his gaze. The realization hit him like a physical blow. You used me, he said, voice breaking. Richard didn't deny it. Security pushed Evan back toward the door. He stopped, looked at me, his voice hoarse. This isn't over. I looked at him steadily. For you. It might be. He glared one last time before they let him out. Richard straightened his suit, though his hands shook. You think the courts will side with you, Ethan? You think this ends here? I stepped closer, meeting his eyes. I don't need prison to make you pay. I just need you off my father's land. For a long time, neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, the traffic far below. Then something in him broke, his shoulders sagged, the fight leaving his face. Patricia gathered the papers, her voice calm and final. The board will reconvene tomorrow to confirm the revocation. Until then, you're advised not to leave the city. Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the skyline, the empire he'd built shimmering in the glass, already beginning to crumble. When we left the room, the hallway felt colder. Patricia exhaled slowly. It's done, she said. Not yet, I replied, but it's close. As the elevator doors closed, I caught one last glimpse through the glass. Richard stood alone at the head of the table, the city lights reflecting off his face like shards of the life he'd stolen. For the first time, he looked small. Chapter 7. When justice takes form 3 weeks later, the world knew everything. Mason Reed, an investigative journalist with a taste for blood and truth in equal measure, published his story. The headline stretched across every major outlet in the country. The billionaire who broke good men. He wrote about the fraud, the cover-ups, the fabricated evidence, and the company built on the bones of others. He wrote about me too, though not by name at first. When the story reached the national networks, he used it. Ethan Cole. A man whose life was dismantled to protect a brand. Hendrix Industries' stock began to crumble before noon. By the end of the week, investors were demanding Richard's resignation. The board held emergency meetings that went nowhere, and the news cameras lined the streets outside his tower, like vultures waiting for a fall. I watched it all from my apartment in Denver, the television light flickering across the room. Every channel replayed the same images of Richard leaving the building, surrounded by microphones, his smile gone, his silence louder than words. Patricia called that morning. She said the court had scheduled the final hearing to confirm ownership transfer. Her tone was brisk, controlled, the way it always was when she wanted to hide that she cared. You did it, Ethan. You won. I looked at the screen again. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, just tired. Later that day, I got a message from Melissa. It was short and plain, asking to meet. Against every instinct I went. The cafe was small, tucked on a quiet street in the west side of the city. She was already there, sitting by the window. Her hair had more gray than I remembered, and her eyes were swollen from crying. When she saw me, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile people use when they know they don't deserve forgiveness, but hope for it anyway. She started talking before I could sit down. I'm sorry, Ethan. For everything. For believing him. For hurting you. I thought I was protecting myself. I thought I was protecting our kids. Her words spilled out in pieces, disjointed, desperate. I listened but said nothing. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and tell her it was all right. The other part remembered every night I spent wondering why. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. When the sobs quieted, I reached into my jacket and took out an envelope. I placed it on the table between us. Inside was the signed divorce decree, finalized and stamped. She looked at it, her lips trembling. Is this it? She whispered. I stood up. It's what's left. Her fingers brushed the paper like it might burn. I turned and walked out before she could say anything else. The air outside was cold, the kind that bites at the edges of your coat. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, listening to the sound of the city moving on. That night Patricia called again, her voice lighter this time. Evan Jennings has been suspended. There's a federal investigation into his partnership with Richard. Looks like the board finally woke up. Then she paused. The court just confirmed your ownership. They approved the conversion request. Summit Ridge will be transferred into community property under your management. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure what gratitude was supposed to sound like anymore. After the call, I drove out to Summit Ridge. The construction cranes stood silent against the evening sky. The buildings were still lit, but the glow felt hollow, like stage lights after the actors had gone home. I walked the perimeter, the air filled with the faint hum of transformers and the scent of wet soil. Somewhere beneath my feet was the ground my father had once dreamed on. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine him here, standing beside Arthur, marking out the future with steady hands and honest hope. It didn't feel like revenge anymore. It felt like responsibility. The next morning, Caleb called from Street Lewis. His voice carried a mix of pride and relief. Dad, you did it. It's all official. The land is yours. The judge even praised the redevelopment plan. He laughed softly. You know, you could finally rest now, maybe even take a vacation. I smiled. Maybe someday. There was a pause, then his tone softened. I'm proud of you. The words caught me off guard. Thank you, I said quietly, for believing me when no one else did. That evening, Rachel stopped by my apartment. She looked tired from long shifts at the hospital, her hair tied back, a faint smudge of ink on her wrist where she'd written notes. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a letter sealed in a plain envelope. Arthur wrote this before he died, she said. Patricia found it in his things and sent it to me. She told me to give it to you when it felt right. I opened it slowly. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. Use victory to lift others, not to crush them. The words hit like a quiet tide. Simple, final, true. Rachel watched me read, her eyes gentle. He believed in you, Dad. So do I. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. My throat tightened, but I managed to speak. You remind me of him sometimes, she smiled faintly. You mean stubborn? Maybe that too. She laughed softly, then leaned over and hugged me. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd held my daughter like that. When she left, I stayed at the window, watching the city lights spread out like a map of everything I'd lost and somehow found again. I thought about Arthur, about my father, about the years that had been taken and the years still left. Justice had come, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like balance returning, slow and inevitable. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face, older, lined, but no longer haunted. I didn't feel triumphant, only empty. But maybe emptiness was where rebuilding began. Outside, the night was quiet, the world still turning, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was chasing ghosts. I felt like I was finally walking towards something worth keeping. Chapter 8. The Man Who Returned to Summit Ridge. A year later, the air at Summit Ridge smelled of new beginnings. The dust of construction had settled, and the sound of engines and saws had given way to laughter, footsteps, and life. I walked the newly paved path that curved toward the glass-fronted building, gleaming in the afternoon light. On the side of the building, in brushed steel letters, were the words, "The Thomas and Elaine Foundation." My father's name, my mother's, together at last on something that would outlive us both. The sun warmed the stones beneath my shoes as I crossed the courtyard. Children from the nearby community center were painting murals on the low walls. Volunteers carried boxes of supplies toward the clinic next door, their voices bright against the hum of the city. It was hard to believe that this same land had once been a battleground for greed and pride. Now it was something else entirely. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. The main lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and paper. A photograph of the original construction site from 1991 hung on the wall, framed in dark oak. Two men stood side by side in the picture, young and certain of the future. My father, Arthur. Caleb appeared from the hallway, sleeves rolled up, a folder tucked under his arm. He smiled the way his grandfather used to, easy but focused. "Dad, the outreach team just finished the brief for the Anderson case," he said. "It's good. We're representing 3 workers who were fired after reporting unsafe conditions." I nodded. "You like the work?" He grinned. "It feels right. It feels like we're fixing things instead of fighting them." Rachel stepped in behind him, carrying a tray of coffee cups. She looked tired but proud, her scrubs streaked with ink and the faint smell of disinfectant. She set the tray down on a table and stretched her neck. "The clinic's booked through next week," she said. "We had to add evening hours." "That's a good problem to have," I said. She smiled. "You sound like Arthur." I paused, the words catching in my chest. Maybe that was the highest compliment she could have given me. We stood together by the window, overlooking the courtyard. Across the way, the clinic sign caught the sunlight. Rachel's name was painted beneath it as medical director. Caleb's office shared the same floor as the legal aid center. They were building lives out of something that once nearly destroyed ours. Later that afternoon, when the workday slowed, I went to my office on the second floor. The walls were still mostly bare, but I had one photo waiting to hang. It was the same picture Arthur had shown me on that first rainy night in Denver, the one with him and my father signing their first contract. I placed it carefully on the wall above my desk, straightened the frame, and stepped back. For a long time, I just looked at it. Their faces, the hope in their eyes, the dirt on their hands. The foundation they built had finally found its purpose. Out in the courtyard, a figure stood near the trees. At first, I didn't recognize her. Then she turned slightly, and I saw her face. Melissa. She was watching Rachel through the clinic window, her posture hesitant, unsure whether to approach. She didn't notice me. I stayed where I was, behind the glass, and didn't move to stop her or call out. She didn't belong to the war anymore. She belonged to the quiet after. Rachel must have sensed her presence because she looked up from the reception desk. Their eyes met across the glass wall. Neither smiled, neither spoke. There was no anger, no apology left between them. Just a kind of peace that came from knowing the past had finally stopped reaching for them. Melissa turned after a moment and walked away, her figure fading down the path toward the gates. Evening light poured through the windows, golden and soft. The city beyond Summit Ridge shimmered in the distance, calm for the first time in years. I walked back to my desk and found a small envelope there, left by Patricia that morning. Inside was a short note and a clipping from a business paper. The headline read, "Former Hendricks Industries, VP donates remaining shares to Thomas and Elaine Foundation. Evan." I read it twice, trying to imagine what had driven him to do it. Maybe guilt, maybe something better. Either way, it meant the final piece of that old empire now belonged here, back where it started. Richard Hendricks had vanished months earlier. No interviews, no statements, no trace. His company appointed a new CEO, one who promised transparency and reform, but in truth, Richard's story had already ended the day he lost the right to the ground beneath his feet. I sat by the window, the last of the sunlight spilling across my desk. The sounds of the foundation below reached me faintly. Laughter, conversation, the rhythm of something alive and honest. When we stop chasing revenge, justice finds its own way home. I whispered it to myself, a quiet truth I had learned the hard way. Outside, Caleb was talking with a group of law students volunteering for the summer. Rachel waved to a child, running across the courtyard. The world was still imperfect, but maybe that was the point. No one truly wins in revenge, only those brave enough to turn pain into something good. Sometimes, the ground beneath our feet is where justice was waiting all along. I leaned back in my chair, the picture of my father and Arthur catching the last light of the day. For the first time in years, the silence felt kind. If you've ever carried a wound too long, if you've ever waited for something to make sense again, stay a while. Stories like this aren't about endings. They're about finding what's left worth saving. And sometimes, that's where the real beginning starts.